Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. Tonight, I'm delighted to be introducing Dr. Annetta Hagen, who's here to talk about the Brothers Grimm. This event has proved unbelievably popular, with some 470 people booked up from all over the world to view it. So thank you for joining. You're more than welcome into our homes, basically, at the moment. Annetta has been a rare books curator at the National Library of Scotland since 2002. She curates our early printed collections to the year 1700 and looks after the Gaelic and Scots collections to 1900. Tonight, though, as I've said, she is going to indulge one of her other interests, early 19th century German literature, and talk about, as I've said, the Brothers Grimm, who did far more than collect fairy tales. I'm so looking forward to hearing this talk. But before handing over to Annetta, can I just say that there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar, so get thinking and just type your question into the Q&A function, and we will do our best to get through as many as we can. But for now, over to you, Annetta.
Thank you very much, Kenny, for this kind introduction. Good evening, everybody, or good morning, wherever you might be. This talk, as Kenny has said, is about the Brothers Grimm and the question, were they actually living a fairy tale? First of all, though, I'm going to share my screen with you. Hang on, here we go. Right, so once upon a time, there were two little brothers who lived in a big house in a small town with their father and mother and 4 siblings. Their father died when they were very small, and the family had to move in with a rich auntie. She paid for the boys' schooling. They worked really hard and passed their exams with flying colours, and then they left home to go to university. There they met a beautiful prince who was rich and took them under his wing. He introduced them to poetry and to traditional stories, and they found that they really loved fairy tales. They didn't know many stories themselves, but they asked other people to tell them theirs. The brothers put them together in a book and sold the book, and the book became such a success that they could take care of their smaller brothers and sisters. Then they both became librarians and lived very happily, but only for a while. The old king of their country died and was succeeded by his son, who was really bad and mean. This new king never gave the brothers any pay rise and overlooked them for promotion. Worse, he ordered them to buy expensive but very scratchy and uncomfortable uniforms they had to wear to work. Finally, they had had enough and left their country to become librarians in a different town. The older brother even became a professor. But then the old king in that country died too, and the new king was a really bad and mean man. He ordered them to swear an oath of allegiance to him, but the 2 brothers and 5 of their friends refused. They were expelled from the university and told to leave the country. But they were now famous, and another king in another country called them to his capital city. He gave them high academic honors and lots of time and money to research and teach, and the 2 brothers lived happily ever after. That's the fairy tale version of the lives of the Brothers Grimm. Now to the historical reality. Jacob Grimm was born in 1785, Wilhelm in 1786. They were the oldest of 6 children. Their father was a district magistrate, which is a lawyer, with a comfortable income. The family lived in Hanau in the Landgraviate of Hesse-Kassel, a provincial territory in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. This geopolitical background is vital to understand the brothers' moves, so don't switch off yet. When they were 11 and 10 years old, respectively, their father died and left the family in dire financial straits. Within weeks, they had to leave their home. They went to Kassel, where their mother's sister Henriette lived, and moved in with her. Henriette was a lady in waiting for the Countess of Hesse-Kassel and had sufficient means to provide for her widowed sister and her family. Jakob and Wilhelm excelled at school and both enrolled at Marburg University to study law, Jakob in 1802 and Wilhelm in 1803, in order to follow in their father's footsteps. Now, the beautiful prince of my fairy tale version was Friedrich Karl von Savigny, a law lecturer at Marburg University, who would become the founder of historical jurisprudence. Von Savigny took Jakob and Wilhelm under his wing at Marburg, and he came to have a profound personal and indeed professional influence on them. He inspired the brothers to explore ancient German literature, and he played a big part in arousing their interest in traditional tales and folk poetry. To start with, he gave them free access to his well-stocked private library. It is also to von Savigny's credit that the brothers learned to appreciate the value of historical observation and comparison. Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm lived during the age of Romanticism. Part of this literary, aesthetic, and cultural movement, which is usually dated from the end of the 18th to the middle of the 19th centuries, saw a surge of interest in the written tradition of the common people, in folk poetry and folk tales, but from a scholarly point of view. For the Grimm brothers, this interest was first and foremost philological. Jakob and Wilhelm were no folklorists, but language and literature scholars. So much so that Jakob actually gave up his legal studies in 1806 to devote himself entirely to the study of philology. Wilhelm did finish his law degree, but never took a job in the field of jurisprudence. Instead, like Jakob, he spent a lot of his time as a private scholar. Not exactly a money-spinning occupation. Indeed, the financial affairs in the Grimm household would be, well, grim, precarious for a long time to come. In 1806, Jakob managed to find employment in the War Office as secretary to the War Commissioner of Hesse. What had happened? Well, in August 1806, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was dissolved. This was a political entity in Western and Central Europe made up of some 300 sovereign territories, such as kingdoms, duchies, free imperial cities, and church territories. As Voltaire famously quipped, it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. After the victory of the French under Napoleon Bonaparte in Jena in 1806, it was no more. This huge political entity was carved up. Kassel in Electoral Hesse, where the Grimm family lived, was annexed to the newly founded Kingdom of Westphalia, which was ruled by Napoleon's brother Jerome, with Kassel as its capital. In 1808, Jakob became King Jerome's court librarian. This was at least some good news, but for the Grimms, as doubtless for many others, the French occupation was a catastrophe, not least because French became the official language of Westphalia. There were protests against the foreign rule, which in turn also stirred people's rediscovery of their own cultural and linguistic identity. New borders were created in Europe, but regional principalities with their own sovereigns remained the order of the day. After Napoleon's disastrous 1812 campaign in Russia, his troops were driven out of Hesse too. In 1813, Elector Wilhelm I returned from exile in Denmark and resumed not only his role as ruler, but he reinstated the conditions of 1806. That meant that officers had to revert to their former ranks, and soldiers had to wear their old uniforms, and the powdered pigtails were back in fashion. For the Grimms, however, the restoration was a welcome development. In 1814, Only a few months after the restoration of the electorate, Wilhelm became secretary to the Actors' Library. In 1816, Jakob, who had served as a diplomat in Paris and Vienna for the past 2 years, was made second librarian in charge. The brothers stayed in these posts until 1829. These 13 years were a period of relative calm, stability, prosperity, and allowed them to pursue their many and varied research projects. We drink. Their fields of study ranged from literature to law, fairy tales and legends, linguistic history and history of writing to philology, and the published output of the research was very impressive indeed. Apart from books, they also produced some 350 essays, reviews, and prefaces. Jakob's first papers were entitled About the Correspondence Between Old Legends and Thoughts about the Relationship Between Legends and Poetry. Wilhelm followed suit in 1809 with his essay About the Origins of German Poetry and its Relationship to Nordic Poetry. In 1811, their first monographs were published. Jakob's book dealt with the old German minne song, and Wilhelm's was about old Danish heroic songs, ballads, and tales. The following year, 1812, saw their first collaboration, an edition of the two oldest German poems, the 8th century Song of Hildebrand and the Weserbrunner Prayer. 1812 was also the year of the first publication of the fairy tales. But for now, I'd like to stay with philology, the historical study of language and literature. The work that made Jakob's name as the founder of German linguistics is a 4-volume opus entitled German Grammar. This monumental work about the history of and relations between Germanic languages was more than 20 years in the making. The first volume was published in 1819 and the fourth in 1837. Grimm undertook a historical comparative study of modern German, its precursors Old and Middle High German and Gothic, West Germanic languages including Old English, and North Germanic languages such as Norse and Old Danish. The poet Heinrich Heine compared the work German Grammar to a Gothic cathedral in which all Germanic nations raised their voices like giant choirs. It's beautiful, isn't it? The new comparative methodology was groundbreaking and had a long-term impact. One of Jakob's investigations concerned a sound change in certain consonants. Doesn't sound terribly interesting, but it was. The phenomenon itself was first noted by the Danish scholar Rasmus Rask in 1818, but it was Jakob Grimm who properly explored it in his German grammar. And he recognized that the sound change was systematic rather than arbitrary, and was thus able to establish that it marks the departure of German languages from the Indo-European family. The rule governing the sound change is known as Grimm's law. The work which Jakob himself considered his masterpiece was his History of the German Language. Published in 1848, this bold work tries to establish how German is related to other languages and what its linguistic particularities are. In the interest of disclosure, I should add that not everybody shared Jakob's high estimation of this book. A joint philological venture of both brothers was the German Dictionary, known simply as the Grimm. Work on this project started in 1838. They estimated that it would take about 10 years and be published in 6 or 7 volumes. But it took 16 years until even the first volume appeared, and in the end, the German Dictionary ran to 32 volumes. The last one was only published in 1961, which means it took 123 years to complete. Jakob himself got to the letter F for fruit. The Grimm has 330,000 headwords. It is fair to say that while Jakob excelled both in the linguistic and literary fields, Wilhelm's interests lay more exclusively in the area of literature. Like Jakob, he took very much a historical approach too. Their first joint collection of folk literature, after the fairy tales, were 2 volumes entitled German Legends, published between 1816 and 18. Legends, unlike fairy tales, are about real people and real events in the distant past. The brothers collected 585 legends for this publication, including, for instance, the famous Pied Piper of Hamelin. They lifted many of them from secondary sources and interpreted, modified, and rewrote them. This kind of methodology was applied to collections of tales and legends across Europe by all sorts of international scholars. The brothers' interest in North Germanic languages resulted in their German edition of the Norse songs of the older Edda. They announced their intention to publish it in 1811, but they were overtaken by another German scholar whose edition appeared in 1812 because competition to publish old manuscripts was really fierce. The Grimms eventually produced a much slimmer version than intended in 1815. And they also had a lively interest in Scottish and Irish folk literature. As early as 1813, Wilhelm edited a translation of 3 Old Scots ballads into German. 2 of them were from Walter Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. In 1826, the brothers published a translation into German of Thomas Crofton Croker's Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland, under the title Irische Elfenmärchen. Wilhelm in particular was interested in Old and Middle High German texts. One of the results of his research was a critical edition of the 11th century Song of Roland. He had compared several manuscript versions and produced an authoritative text in Old High German with ample scholarly footnotes, Ruhrlandeslied, in 1838. He also wrote a book on German runes and issued a collection of German heroic legends. Now let's return to politics and the circumstances under which the Grimms devised, researched, wrote up, and published their large oeuvre. By 1816, both William and Jakob had secure positions as librarians of Elector Wilhelm I of Hesse. Not exactly top jobs, but as we say, they offered the brothers the opportunity to pursue their own research interests. After the death of Wilhelm I in 1821, the new Elector of Hesse, Wilhelm II, started to make his own mark by dissociating himself from his father and indeed his mother. This was the Countess for whom the Grimms' aunt was a lady in waiting. Now the Grimms were on pretty familiar terms with the Countess, and evidently she thought very highly of them. But since her son didn't approve of the old regime she represented, the brothers were made to feel the new elector's displeasure by association, as it were. They were ignored for pay rises and promotion, and Jakob was tasked with looking after the library's accounts, which meant lots of additional paperwork. Moreover, the brothers were ordered to copy out the contents of all 60 volumes of the library's catalogue, a job on which they wasted about 18 months of quality time. In 1829, finally, things came to a head. The old chief librarian died, and Jakob and Wilhelm, quite rightly, expected to be promoted. They wrote a letter of application to the elector, but were promptly refused. To add to this insult, an incapable amateur called Dietrich Christoph Rummel was appointed as chief librarian of the Electoral Library. By all accounts, this man mistook bookworm traces for runes and identified charts from local households as Roman antiquities. The elector was probably unaware of Rummel's incompetence, but equally of the Grimm brothers' fame. Now the headhunters, who had previously tried in vain to entice the brothers away from Kassel, got their chance. The University of Göttingen offered Jakob the posts of Professor of Philosophy and University Librarian, and Wilhelm that of Sub-Librarian. With the University Library at Göttingen being one of, if not the best in Germany, this was an offer they couldn't refuse. Too late, Elector Wilhelm II realized that the Grimms' departure would entail a huge loss of prestige for him and his court, but his belated offer of steep pay rises and promotion did not sway them to stay in Kassel. The brothers already had a network of contacts in Göttingen. A local publisher, Heinrich Dietrich, had produced Jakob's German grammar and his legal antiquities, as well as Wilhelm's book on German runes and his German heroic legends. Moreover, the brothers had been corresponding members of the Göttingen Academy of Sciences since 1824, and to cap it all, Wilhelm's wife, Henrietta Dorothea, was the granddaughter of the first university librarian of Göttingen. Well, if that wasn't a good omen. After their arrival in Göttingen, the brothers' first task was to network. In practice, this involved more than 60 visits, as well as dinners, soupers, and balls that had to be attended, and Jakob and Wilhelm found these rituals rather tiring. It didn't help either that Jakob couldn't stand lobster salads and salmon patties, the posh fare of such events. Their new life posed other unexpected challenges too, apart from the seafood. The transition from working and doing research in a provincial library to academic teaching and working as university librarians. This meant much heavier workloads than in Kassel, and they soon complained that there wasn't enough time for their own research. Göttingen Library held 3 to 4 times as many books as the Elector's Library in Kassel, about 200,000 volumes. But the size of the collection wasn't the issue. The brothers were now expected to act as what we call user services librarian and administer the purchase and the use of books, rather than use the stock book for research themselves. Jakob was responsible for the acquisition of new books and Wilhelm for loans. And in addition, they were both tasked with the revision of the index card catalogue. Jakob in particular had a lot on his plate in his dual role as professor and librarian. It took 5 years after their arrival in Göttingen before he was released of his library duties. Jakob's teaching commitments, according to the lecture timetable, included law, Oriental and ancient languages, literary history, and historical sciences. As was common practice, Jakob lectured in a room on the ground floor of their home. He usually gave 4 lectures of 50 minutes per week. The number of attendees varied between 20 and 58. And in 1831, Wilhelm too was appointed professor of philosophy. This appointment was a nice touch, really, because it didn't represent a recognition of his academic achievements. Rather, Wilhelm was really ill with pneumonia, and the university wanted to ensure that his wife would receive a widow's pension if it came to the worst. But it didn't, and after he had recovered, Wilhelm too had to start lecturing. It wasn't long before politics interrupted the brothers' lives again. Göttingen belonged to the Kingdom of Hanover, whose sovereign, King Wilhelm IV, died in 1837. You will know him better as King William IV of Great Britain and Ireland. It's the same guy. His successor in Hanover was his anti-liberal and reactionary brother, Ernst August. Wilhelm IV had given his blessing to a relatively liberal constitution for Hanover in 1833, so 4 years before his death. And Ernst August, his successor, torpedoed this from the start. He declared that, since the constitution had been introduced without his agreement, he wasn't bound by it. He dissolved the regional parliament, revoked the constitution of 1833, and declared the older one of 1819 to be valid. In this blatant attempt at restoring absolutism and the Kingdom of Hanover, he also released the entirety of royal or civil servants from their oath to the 1833 Constitution. That included the 41 professors teaching at Göttingen University. 2 weeks later, 7 of these professors, including Wilhelm and Jakob Grimm, handed in a written protestation to put their concerns on record. The text somehow got leaked and was copied and distributed widely, and its public impact was enormous. To put it bluntly, the Göttinger Seven, as they came to be known, accused King Ernst August of breaching the constitution, and they refused to obey his order to swear a new oath of homage to him. They weren't at all liberal Democrats, but they were incensed by the symbolic power of this royal sleight of hand. The Göttinger Seven were discharged from their posts, and 3 of them, including Jakob, but not Wilhelm, were also ordered to leave the Kingdom of Hanover within 3 days. Jakob went into exile in Kassel, where the old elector's widow received him gracefully. Notes of solidarity for the Göttinger Seven poured in from all over Germany, and probably more importantly, private donations to secure the living expenses of the 7 professors, at least for the short term. Even memorabilia were produced, beer tumblers and pipe bowls with a picture of the Göttinger Seven. Wilhelm and his family soon joined Jakob in Kassel. The brothers entertained hopes of attaining posts variously at Marburg, Zurich, Oldenburg, Weimar, Hamburg, but nothing materialized because the reigning sovereigns prevented them from being appointed to university posts in their territories. The brothers settled down in Kassel, but soon found themselves in difficult financial circumstances. And it was for this reason that they entered into a contract with a publisher in Leipzig and started preparations for their dictionary project. Just imagine, they embarked on this German dictionary out of financial necessity. Once again, it was the accession to the throne of a new king that changed the brothers' fate. This time, the death of King Friedrich III of Prussia in 1840 and the succession of his son, Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, presented exciting opportunities for the Grimms. Because the new king was intent on attracting excellent men to the capital, Berlin. And the brothers also had some influential lobbyists there. In due course, the Minister of Culture was ordered to gain the Grimms as academics for the University of Berlin. They didn't receive an official call to professorships, but instead were offered a substantial pension out of the king's private coffers to continue the work on their dictionary. In addition, they had the right to research and to give lectures at the university as members of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. The brothers were thus not employed by the government and therefore technically not civil servants. In this way, the King of Prussia kept his promise to the King Ernst August of Hanover, who actually happened to be his uncle, not to take the Grimms into official service. Jakob was 56 and Wilhelm 55 when they took up residence in Berlin in 1841. And here, despite the huge burden of the dictionary work, they were finally not only financially secure, but comfortably off. Jakob retired from his professorship in 1848, Wilhelm in 1852, and they really did live happily ever after. Well, more precisely, Jakob died aged 78 and Wilhelm aged 73. Finally, to the fairy tales. Let's jump back to 1805. Jakob is 20 and Wilhelm 19. It is the height of the Romantic movement, and the brothers are pursuing their quest for the common people's poetical and cultural identity. The poetic heart and soul of the simple folk was seen to be preserved in its purest form in the songs and ballads, tales and legends that had been passed on orally through the generations. The Grimms were by no means the only collectors of this material. The poet Clemens von Brentano, the son-in-law of the brothers' old mentor von Savigny at Marburg, had been introduced to Jacob and Wilhelm in 1804, and a year later, Clemens von Brentano published an anthology of folk songs under the title The Boy's Wonderhorn, and started to gather folk tales for a second volume. And he asked the brothers for their help in collecting tales, and this is the start for the Grimms. They had already made a little bit of a start gathering stories by simply copying them out from manuscripts and from books they found in libraries. But as a result of Brentano's request for help, they turned their attention to the oral tradition rather than to written sources. How did they go about that? Well, a folklorist would take his notepad and pen, travel from village to village to seek out peasants, servants, artisans, and other common folk, ask them to tell them the tales they knew, and transcribe them there and then. Wilhelm Grimm at least tried this method. He approached a tailor, a servant girl, and a shepherd, but his potential interviewees didn't actually want to tell him any stories. The brothers thus resorted to other means of collecting by making clever use of already existing networks closer to home. Their sister Lotte spent much of her time in the company of the 6 daughters of the Wild family across the road. A favorite pastime of the girls was reading and telling stories to each other. Wilhelm set up a small literary circle and invited the Wild girls, and other members of the educated middle classes of Kassel joined the reading circle too. Wilhelm and Jacob came to appreciate the girls as a major source of oral tales. The earliest transcription of a fairy tale, Child of Mary, was taken down by Wilhelm from Gretchen Wild in 1807. Her sister Dortchen, Wilhelm's future wife, added Hänsel and Gretel and Rumpelstiltskin. Between them, the Wild girls contributed about 30 fairy tales. Collecting stories from the daughters of families they were friendly with, most of them, in fact, noble families, soon became the Grimms' working pattern. In 1809, Jacob was introduced to the Van Hassenpflugs, whose 4 daughters contributed, for instance, Little Red Riding Hood and Sleeping Beauty. Wilhelm visited the family on several occasions to transcribe stories from the sisters, and in between visits, the girls sent their own transcriptions to the Grimms. By 1810, the brothers had gathered some 50 fairy tales. Now, just to be on the safe side, they copied them out for themselves before sending the original manuscript to Clemens von Brentano for his second volume of The Boy's Wonderhorn. But Brentano had moved on and lost interest in the project, so he simply abandoned their manuscript, and it was only rediscovered in 1920. Thank goodness for backup copies. The brothers decided to publish their collection of fairy tales themselves. 900 copies of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, or children's and household tales, were published in time for Christmas 1812, with scholarly annotations at the end. The Grimms kept collecting. The daughters of other noble families, the von Droste-Hülshoffs and the von Haxthausens, contributed to the project too. The latter scoured the countryside for news sources such as local servants, nursemaids, and grannies, and even developed a rapport with illiterate shepherds. Some older adults also contributed to the fairy tale collection. One of them was Dorothea Fiemann, the educated wife of a tailor. She was steeped in oral tradition and was capable of repeating whole stories verbatim, which made transcription very easy. She contributed around 40 fairy tales. There was also a retired dragoon sergeant by the name of Johann Friedrich Krause, who wrote down fairy tales, comical stories, conundrums, and anecdotes for the Grimms. The brothers paid the old soldier in kind with second-hand clothes. 6 of Krause's fairy tales made it into the collection, and a second volume of Kinder- und Hausmärchen was published in 1815. The brothers didn't actually acknowledge their sources as such in the published collections. In the first volume, the identities of the young female collectors were concealed altogether. The brothers simply stated that, with very few exceptions, all the tales in this volume had been collected in Hesse from oral tradition. In the second volume, young Maria Hassenpflug appears as Old Maria, and Dorothea Viehmann is credited by name as Viehmännin, and her physical appearance is described in detail. But despite her education and her married status as the wife of a skilled craftsman, the Grimms claimed that she was a peasant woman. All of this was done in order to make the point that it was the simple folk who carried on the storytelling tradition. But not even the stories collected from illiterate shepherds and nursemaids by the Hassenpflug girls, for instance, quite fit that bill, because by the time these stories reached the readers of the fairy tales, they had passed through the pens of educated young females who were themselves experienced readers. It is actually one of the ironies of literary history that while the Grimms concealed their sources, the true origins of the stories themselves eluded them in many cases. Many fairy tales weren't at all of German origin. The von Hassenpflugs, for instance, were of Huguenot descent and spoke French at home. Their stories had come down to them directly from the 17th century French fairy tale tradition, particularly from the stories of Charles Perrault, the compiler of the Mother Goose stories. Dorothea Viehmann too came from a Huguenot family. Some tales, for instance Tom Thumb, were of Scandinavian origin. Little Red Riding Hood and Sleeping Beauty are even considered pan-European phenomena. They are truly international fairy tales. Now, the Grimms didn't collect the tales with a view to entertaining children or indeed adults. The brothers were only accidental entertainers. The primary target audience for the fairy tales was the academic public. The Grimms came to see the potential of their collection for educational purposes, but the tales would first need some editing. So another reason for revising the first edition was that they had received different versions of stories already published. In 1815, Wilhelm started a revision. To make the fairy tales more accessible, he produced simpler sentences and clearer narrative structures, and he introduced dialogue and direct speech to make them more vivid. The scholarly notes were dropped. Other measures to render the fairy tales more child-friendly included the elimination of any erotic or sexual elements and the inclusion of Christian expressions and references. Specific role models for males and females were emphasized as well, this being thought of as didactic. The new target audience were not children themselves directly, but adults who would read the tales to children in their care. Wilhelm thus tried to make the stories more attractive to middle-class or bourgeois audiences rather than the research community. For example, in the original version of Hänsel and Gretel, it is in fact the mother who sends her children out to starve in the forest. Wilhelm didn't think that those mothers he hoped would read the story to their children would find this appropriate, so he edited the mother out and invented the stepmother instead. By 1819, all 900 copies of Volume 1 had been sold, but 350 copies of Volume 2 had to be pulped. The second edition, which came out in 1819, combined the original 2 volumes into one and included some new material too, bringing the total up to 170 fairy tales. However, the Grimms had not given up on the scholarly philological aspects of the fairy tales, because in 1822 they published their scholarly notes and essays in a separate volume. The fairy tales also took off abroad. 1823 saw the first English translation of Volume 1, 1826 that of Volume 2. Entitled German Popular Stories, this translation by Edgar Taylor became a huge publishing success, not least because it was the first edition to include illustrations. The Grimms had already cottoned on to this. They selected 50 fairy tales and engaged their younger brother Ludwig, an artist, to provide illustrations. The resulting so-called small edition, published in 1825, was explicitly aimed at children. It marked the beginning of the commercial success story of the Grimm's fairy tales in German. The first edition of 1,500 copies sold out, and by the time of Wilhelm's death in 1859, it had been reprinted 9 times. The large edition of 1837, with 200 fairy tales and 10 children's legends, became fashionable throughout Europe and beyond. Today, Grimm's fairy tales have been translated into more than 160 languages. They are a global phenomenon, and at least for me, they have not lost any of their attraction, their terror, and their charm since they were written down 2 centuries ago. Thank you.